The silence before humanity's deadliest strike. The war had been burning for 7 years when humanity went silent. To the Alvarez ascendancy, it was not the silence of surrender. There had been no treaty signed, no ceremonial handing over of weapons, no groveling diplomats begging for mercy. It was simply nothing. No patrol skirmishes, no intercepted transmissions, no protests from the scattered human colonies still under siege. The bustling traffic of human comm chatter that intelligence analysts had been monitoring since first contact, a constant background noise of encrypted signals, military codes, and civilian broadcasts, collapsed to a single flat line almost overnight. It was as if the species had vanished, leaving only empty outposts and unresponsive channels in their wake. At first, High Marshal Sareth of the Ascendancy considered it a gift. Humanity had been a thorn in his side since the earliest days of the campaign. Small fleets striking supply lines, irregular forces sabotaging key infrastructure, guerrilla raids on outposts deep inside Ascendancy territory, nothing decisive, but enough to keep his forces bleeding resources. Their technology was primitive compared to the Ascendancy's, but their tactics. Sareth had fought 100 species, and none used cunning quite like the humans. For them to suddenly fall silent, it felt like victory. It also felt wrong. Reports filtered in from the fringes. Recon units dispatched to human-controlled systems found derelict stations with power still running but no crew aboard. Orbital platforms around certain key worlds appeared fully operational, yet no ships moved in or out. On Row 7, the Ascendancy's 19th Legion breached the defenses of a human agricultural colony only to find the fields empty, the cities deserted, and every storage silo scrubbed clean. Even the data cores had been wiped, leaving nothing but bare metal and empty memory partitions. "They're evacuating," suggested the Intelligence Bureau. "Or they've fractured and turned inward." Sareth wasn't convinced. Evacuations. Left trails, supply ships, refugee convoys, signals begging for sanctuary. This silence was too clean, too deliberate. Back in the war capital of Jintharos, the Ascendancy's ruling Triarch debated the situation behind sealed doors. Councillor Veyron, who had once been Sareth's superior, dismissed the concern outright. "They've exhausted themselves," Veyron said. "They've learned what every young race learns, that they cannot stand against the weight of history." Another councillor, Seleth, was less certain. "The humans have defied the weight of history before. Their records show a near-extinction war a century ago, and yet they came back stronger. I do not like this." But the Triarch's verdict was to press the advantage. If humanity was on its knees, now was the time to strike the final blow. Sareth obeyed his orders, but unease gnawed at him. He increased reconnaissance patrols, ordered deep scans of abandoned human infrastructure, and tasked his intelligence officers with decoding whatever faint scraps of transmission still bled through the void. That was when they found it, not a message, but an absence. In several abandoned systems, the deep-range signal spectrums showed narrow-band blackouts, precise slices of frequency range that were simply gone. Not jammed, not blocked. Removed, as though those parts of the spectrum had been cut out of reality itself. The effect was so subtle that most sensors ignored it entirely. But Sareth's analysts traced the pattern and found it repeated across dozens of systems, always at the same intervals, always aligned with the gravitational signatures of certain star systems that humans had once controlled. It wasn't until one of his deep scouts disappeared entirely, vanishing without a distress call, without debris, without so much as a radiation flare, that Sareth began to think the unthinkable. The silence was not a retreat. It was preparation. He didn't share that theory with the Triarch. They wouldn't believe it until it was too late. Instead, he quietly shifted his fleets into more defensive patterns, pulling back from the outermost human systems and reinforcing key shipyards. He doubled the security around Ascendancy supply convoys, anticipating strikes that never came, and still the silence held. In the human borderlands, under the cold light of distant suns, the truth was unfolding far from Sereth's eyes. Beneath the oceans of Delta Pavonis IV, shipyards hidden in volcanic trenches thrummed with activity, building warships whose hulls drank radar and light. In the asteroid fields of Kepler 442, entire mining operations had been repurposed into weapons foundries, producing munitions whose designs came not from any human blueprint, but from the stolen secrets of the Ascendancy itself. Across dozens of lifeless moons, camouflaged relay stations linked into a web of instantaneous communication, immune to jamming and invisible to scans. And at the center of it all, in a subterranean command center on Titan, the architects of the silence watched the enemy relax, shift resources away from certain sectors, and grow complacent. The humans called it Operation Stillwater. And when the stillness broke, the galaxy would never forget it. 2 months into the silence, the first cracks appeared in the Ascendancy's certainty. In the Talon sector, an automated refueling station failed to transmit its weekly report. When a patrol frigate was dispatched to investigate, it found the station offline, its databanks missing, and the skeletal remains of its defense turrets strewn across the docking platform. No human vessels had been detected entering or leaving the sector, yet the security logs, the few fragments that hadn't been wiped, showed an impossible thing. The turrets' targeting systems had been overwritten from inside their own core code. Not hacked remotely, not disabled by brute force, altered as though they had always been programmed to ignore certain ships. High Marshal Sereth reviewed the report in silence, his jaw tightening. This was no scavenger raid. This was a surgical operation. He ordered his intelligence bureau to compile every anomaly from the past 6 months: missing convoys, abandoned stations, unexplained equipment failures. When the data came in, the pattern was unmistakable. Every incident had occurred within the dead zones of spectrum, where human signals had once been thickest. "They've dug in," Sereth muttered to himself. "They're building something in there." Meanwhile, on Titan, Operation Stillwater had entered its final phase. Commander Lysa Trent stood before a sprawling hollow map of Ascendancy space, the blue and red icons marking targets across 3 sectors. Her teams were ghosts. Pilots, saboteurs, cyber warfare specialists, all trained to operate without centralized command for months if necessary. The silence had been their shield, the cloak that let them move through the dark without triggering alarms. Now that shield was about to become a weapon. The final shipments of weapons and fuel were arriving at hidden depots, and relay nodes were broadcasting the last encrypted heartbeat signals to sync every strike group. The operation's philosophy was simple. When the silence broke, it would break everywhere at once. Back in Ascendancy territory, Sereth found himself stonewalled by the Triarch again. Counselor Veyron dismissed his concerns. "Marshal, you are chasing ghosts. If the humans were capable of a coordinated strike, they would have used it before they lost half their territory." Sereth kept his tone neutral. "Perhaps they didn't want half our territory. Perhaps they want it all." But his warning fell on deaf ears. The Triarch, lulled by the lack of open combat, had begun redeploying fleets toward other threats. A brewing rebellion in the southern Spiral Arm, a resource dispute with the Valak Consortium. To them, humanity was already finished. To Sereth, they had simply gone to ground. The first hint that he might be right came from a captured smuggler. The alien, a wiry trader with a knack for slipping between blockades, claimed to have passed through 3 abandoned human systems in recent weeks. In each, he swore, he'd seen signs of movement, heat signatures on moons thought to be lifeless, Flashes of light deep within asteroid belts, shadows passing across the stars that didn't match any known vessel class. Sareth's analysts dismissed the testimony as exaggeration, but something about the smuggler's description gnawed at him, so he quietly ordered recon probes into those sectors. Only one returned, and its final images showed the unmistakable silhouette of a human warship, but not any design Sareth recognized. Its hull was angled and black, its profile built to vanish against the void, and its weapons arrays glowed. With a sickly blue light he knew all too well. It was Ascendancy tech, stolen, replicated, and turned back against them. In the deep silence of Titan's command bunker, Trent received the final green light from the Directorate remnants scattered. Across the surviving human colonies, every unit was in position, every target locked. She knew the risks. Many of the strike groups would never return, but Stillwater had never been about survival. It had been about ending the war in a single blow that the Ascendancy would never recover from. "When we break the silence," she told her staff, "we break their spine." In orbit above Jintharos, Sareth stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the stars beyond the viewport. The silence pressed against him now, heavy and unnatural, like the air before a storm. He'd been in enough campaigns to know that. Battles often began long before the first shot, in the quiet moments when both sides weighed their moves and waited for the other to flinch. The problem was, humanity hadn't flinched. They hadn't moved at all. And that, Sareth realized with a chill, was the move. The silence broke at 03/17, Jintharos Central Time. It began as a low static hiss in the Ascendancy's long-range comm. Networks, so faint it was almost dismissed as background interference. Then, without warning, every military channel in 3 sectors lit up at once with a simple human voice. Calm, measured, and cold. "We were listening. We were waiting. Now we are here." Before any operator could respond, the feed fragmented into a storm of data packets that tore through Ascendancy encryption like tissue, targeting coordinates, activation codes, false orders injected directly into fleet command systems. High Marshal Sareth was already on the bridge when the first alerts came in. "Multiple fleet groups under attack. No enemy ships detected," his comm officer reported, voice taut. "We're losing them, sir. Systems are shutting down from inside." Sareth's gut turned to ice. It wasn't just space fleets. Across dozens of garrison worlds, planetary defense grids powered down as if their operators had flipped the switches themselves. Orbital yards erupted in synchronized explosions, each blast precise enough to cripple a ship without destroying its salvageable tech, a message as much as a strike. In the deep black between the stars, humanity's ghost fleets emerged. Ships that had been shadows for years lit their drives for the first time in silence's duration. They struck without warning, from asteroid fields, from high orbits above supposedly empty moons, from the shadowed flanks of Ascendancy warships that never knew they were there. Every vessel was a predator, every shot deliberate. An enemy cruiser's reactor was breached with a single railgun slug aimed at the one panel humans knew couldn't be shielded. A carrier's fighter bays were gutted by missiles whose trajectories bent in impossible arcs, guided by stolen Ascendancy targeting arrays. The Ascendancy had assumed humanity was scattered and dying. In reality, every day of that silence had been spent mapping their weaknesses to the last circuit. On Titan, Commander Lisa Trent stood in the nerve center of Operation Stillwater, watching. Target icons wink out across the holomap. "Group 7 reports the core relay is down," an officer called. That was the keystone, the central communications hub of the Ascendancy military. With it gone, their ability to coordinate across sectors was shattered. "Proceed to tertiary strikes," Trent ordered. In Jintharos orbit, an Ascendancy dreadnought was gutted from within as boarding drones, launched weeks earlier from an abandoned human freighter, awoke and unleashed their payloads. Sareth's personal fleet fought back viciously, but it was like trying to fight fog with a sword. For every human ship they destroyed, 3 more struck elsewhere. Worse, the humans didn't linger to trade blows. They vanished after each hit, slipping back into stealth or disappearing into pre-planned jump vectors. The Ascendancy's strength was its centralized control. Stillwater's design was to make that control meaningless. Then came the final phase. Across the Ascendancy's inner worlds, civilian networks went dark, replaced by a looping broadcast. It showed recordings from Ascendancy archives humanity should never have had, files of war crimes, planetary purges, and cover-ups that had kept the ruling Triarch in power for centuries. The message was clear: your rulers are not invincible, and they will answer for what they've done. Riots erupted within hours. Garrisons found themselves under siege from their own citizens, just as human strike teams dismantled the last critical military nodes. By the time the Ascendancy Triarch realized the scope of the attack, it was already too late. The silence had been the knife, slowly sliding between the Empire's ribs. The strike was the twist. Fleet losses were catastrophic, communications crippled, public trust in the government fractured beyond repair. On the bridge of his battered flagship, Sareth stood watching the chaos unfold. He was not a man given to admiration for his enemies, but as he surveyed the precision of Stillwater's execution, he knew the truth. They had underestimated humanity in the only way that mattered. They had mistaken patience for weakness, and now the galaxy would remember what patience could do. Far away, in the shadow of Titan's methane seas, Trent received the all-clear from her teams. The strike was over. The Ascendancy's war machine was not destroyed outright, but it no longer had the strength or unity to continue its conquest. The war was effectively ended in one night. "Begin the fade," she ordered. Stillwater's fleets powered down their drives, slipping back into the darkness to watch, to wait for the next threat. Because humanity had learned something in its long silence. Sometimes the most powerful move was not the first strike, but the one that came after absolute stillness.